love playing blues and you're trying to get better at it, but you're frustrated by what you're practicing or the way you're being taught, it may be because you're trying to learn to play blues with a jazz musician's mentality. You might not even know that's what's happening, but if it's happening to you, it can be really frustrating. So in this video, I want to explain what the difference is between learning blues and learning jazz and suggest some things you can do to take back your own practicing so that it's fun and it's getting you where you want to go, not tying you up in knots with a bunch of things you don't need to work on. So this is the thing. Blues and jazz are closely related, and a lot of jazz musicians use the blues. It's an integral part of playing jazz. And blues, like jazz, is an improvising kind of music. So it would seem that blues musicians have a lot they can learn from jazz and from jazz musicians. But here is the problem. The requirements for playing jazz and the requirements for playing blues are different. Jazz is primarily this communal art, and it places a really high emphasis on being able to respond to whatever comes your way. So you are expected to be able to do all things equally well. And that means you should be able to play altered and diminished scales as well as you can play major scales. You should be able to play everything that you know in every key. You should be able to play as many different voicings as you can possibly come up with. And you should know as many songs, as many standards, as many jazz tunes as you possibly can fit into your brain. This is the way that modern jazz is practiced. It's the way that it's taught. There are obviously glaring exceptions to this, but there is a myth around jazz of what it's supposed to be. And I actually think most really serious practicing jazz musicians don't even look at jazz this way. But this is the way jazz is taught. And so when you go looking for instruction, these are the things you come across. Learn this exercise in all 12 keys, learn all these scales, learn all this repertoire. And that would be fine, except that most blues musicians who want to get better are faced with two kinds of learning situations. One is they can learn from someone whose primary emphasis is blues, in which case there's a lot of intuition and a lot of, well, I just kind of do it like this. Or there is the jazz model, which is you got to learn all this stuff. And the reason blues musicians end up in this situation in the first place is you learn a few scales, you learn a few chord progressions, you get to where you can manipulate the 12-bar blues and you can manipulate the pentatonic scale, and then you go, well, what else is there? I want to get better. You go to find a teacher, and that teacher, more often than not, has some kind of jazz background. And they want to teach you tangible stuff. So no teacher is going to say, actually, don't give me your money. Go home and listen to 30 Albert King records. And when you can play like that, come back. They're going to say, well, do you know any scales? Do you know the modes? Do you know how to play this chord progression? Do you know how to play that chord voicing? And if you don't, they'll say, great, let me give you some things to work on. And what that doesn't take into consideration is, what are you actually trying to play? Now, if you are a blues musician who is interested in playing jazz, this will be great because you will get all the tools that you need to start understanding how jazz is played. But if you're a blues musician who's just looking to try to improve their blues playing, you are going to suddenly be bogged down with an enormous amount of requirements that have almost nothing to do with what you really want to work on. So let's think about what you need to play blues. And let's think about the requirements of being a blues musician. Now, I'm talking specifically about playing solo self-accompanied blues, like fingerstyle blues, but to some extent this applies to playing blues in a band also. As opposed to this jazz model of being ready for anything, solo self-accompanied blues, you only have to be ready to play the songs that you're going to play. And if you think about the great solo blues musicians, Did they play in every key? I mean, even if we remove the solo part of it, if you go and get an Elmore James anthology, 90% of those songs are in the key of D, because Elmore James played slide guitar and he tuned open D. So when he went to play, he played in D. Now there's of course other tunes and there's exceptions to that, but that's just one really good example. Even, someone like John Hurt, who had a wide repertoire, he played in C, he played in D, he played in A, he played in E. Thank you, good night, right? You don't have to worry about being able to fingerpick in B flat to hang out with John Hurt's music and learn how to play like that. Now there are exceptions. There are people like Blind Blake and Gary Davis who were clearly fluent all over the neck and who took great pride in being able to play in keys other than the keys that most guitar players play in. But for the most part, you get people like John Hurt, like Elmore James, like Lightnin' Hopkins playing primarily in E and primarily in A. And these are improvising musicians when you get to someone like Lightnin' Hopkins, or John Lee Hooker. But they're exploiting what the guitar can do. Even when they're playing with a band, they're doing what the guitar does. Now, that is one end of the spectrum. And obviously the played in all 12 keys is the other end of the spectrum. We have the advantage, with our access to everything that's been recorded in the entire 20th century and now in the 21st century, of being able to collapse all that and go, well, what do I want to take from these? Okay, maybe you want to be fluent in more than just E and A, but does that mean you have to go so far as to worry about being able to play in D flat? That's up to you. But if you're primarily interested in blues, you do not have to take on this burden of mastering things in all keys, of mastering scales that you are never going to need to play the music that you are currently interested in. You don't need a Lydian scale to play blues. Now, if the day comes when you are like, I really like the sound of Lydian, I wonder how that would work if I play that, if I, found a way to use that, on playing The Thrill Is Gone. I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but if that's what you want to try to figure out how to do, then that's fantastic. And having that information will give you the leverage to do something that hasn't been done before. And that might be totally cool. But you need to recognize that it may not be necessary, and that given the limits of time and space and your practice schedule, you may not need to do all those things that you've been advised to do to play the music that you want to play. So the real question is, what do we do with that idea or that information? What do we do with the idea that you don't need to learn all that stuff? Well, I always think it makes sense to really zero in on the thing you want to be able to do the most. So if you really want to be able to play single note electric blues, then maybe you don't have to worry about playing fingerstyle guitar, and maybe you don't have to worry about playing the Lydian scale. But you do want to focus on playing electric blues the best you can. And if most electric blues is based around just a few scales, now you have a different proposition, which isn't how many scales do I need to know in how many positions, because most blues guitar players play a few scales in just a couple of positions. Now you're free to focus on what really matters to that kind of blues guitar player, which is your phrasing, or your vibrato, or your hammer-on technique, or your tone. I mean, all these different things. It's not that blues is necessarily simpler than jazz. It may have a simpler vocabulary, but that doesn't make it any less complicated to play. And I don't mean to overcomplicate it either, but every art form, every kind of music has its value system and has its priorities. And, anybody who's listened to jazz guitar from the 40s and 50s knows, tone's important, but jazz guitar players didn't obsess. Well, maybe they did, but they didn't obsess about tone the way we obsess about it today. The way electric guitar players really dial in, how to get the most amazing tone from their equipment. And there's a whole set of values around how to make blues guitar sound amazing. And it's not necessarily about playing the diminished scale. It's about your touch and your phrasing and your tone and your choices, your taste, all those things. And so when you stop putting energy into harmonic and melodic material you may not need, it frees up energy to put it into the things that you really need to know to play that kind of music. And by the same token, if you're interested primarily in fingerstyle guitar, you don't need to really think about your electric guitar tone at all, because you're maybe not even playing electric guitar. And you may not need to think about how to find those scales up the neck, because there is so much music you can make down in the open position. So again, making a choice about what your most important thing is can really free up your energy to really put it into the thing that matters the most to you, and to really, once you decide, once you narrow things down to this pinhole and you go through that pinhole, I'm not sure how you fit through a pinhole, but go with me on this, then it opens up again and suddenly there's all this stuff you can see. You know what I mean? Because if you have ever had a friend who was into a genre you didn't understand, and they put on a bunch of different songs in this genre that they love, and you go, these songs all sound the same to me. They're like, no, man, they all sound different. Listen to this one and that one and this one. It's the same thing. If you decide you're all in for fingerstyle guitar, suddenly there's all these things that matter on the instrument that don't matter at all to someone who's playing with a pick. And by the same token, if you get all in on playing electric blues, then there are all these things that matter to you that aren't going to matter to someone who's playing like this. And the same thing is also true if you decide that what you really do want to learn to do is play jazz. I'm not saying that's not a great idea. I'm just saying, think about what matters and why you're doing it, so that you don't end up down this rabbit hole of learning a bunch of things you don't need if it's not relevant to the thing that matters the most to you. So that is my rant about that. And as far as what you can actively do about this, figure out what the thing is that you really want to play the most and try to organize your practicing and your priorities around that. And you can always have these field trips over here and over there to these other things that interest you, but you'll possibly find your practicing more satisfying and your progress more swift if you pick one thing to zero in on. And you're not going to be doing just one thing, because anything you pick is going to have a really, it's going to expand outward the more you get into it, and you're going to find more and more things inside of it. But if, for instance, you are all in on fingerstyle guitar, well, inside of that, there's steady bass, and there's alternating thumb, and there's syncopated grooves, and there's open tunings, and there's slide guitar. I mean, already it's getting wide again. And the same is true for these other things I've been mentioning. So if you can figure out what it is that really matters to you, you can figure out what it is you really need to work on based on where you're trying to get to, and you can reverse engineer your practicing based on what it is you're really trying to play. Of course, if what you're really trying to play is fingerstyle blues, naturally, I suggest checking out my membership, the Fingerstyle 5, which you can learn more about at the link below, or the link on screen, or from any of the dozens and dozens of free lessons here on the channel. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you've got a question or a comment about today's video, particularly a thought about your own learning process or any kind of educational experience you've had trying to learn blues or jazz, I would love to hear about it. Drop me a line at the link below, and I'll see you next time.